as always, welcome to the channel. Where are my 4.8 liter fans? You know, the 4.8, the 4 point great, or the 4.8, depending on what your feelings are for the little 4.8 liter. Personally, I think that they're awesome. And today we're going to look at a whole bunch of different cams. And by whole bunch, I mean like 4 of them. The stock one and 3 other performance cams, including one or maybe more that is the wrong cam. The question today is not what do these cams do. We're going to take a look at that as always. But what happens if I do choose the wrong cam for my 4.8 liter? What else can I do short of swapping in another cam to really make it run right? You know what I'm talking about? You know, converters, gearing, shift points. What can I do when I choose the wrong cam? Okay guys, let's jump right in and find out what happens if you were to maybe pick the wrong cam for your application, and what can we adjust to maybe make it work if you're going to take this car, like, you know, to the drag strip. We could adjust things like the stall speed of the converter, maybe your shift points, maybe gearing or tire size, those kinds of things. So we're going to talk about that a little bit and find out what you might be able to change to make your wrong cam work. But we're going to start off with the right cam, or basically the cam that most everybody would have if they've got a motor in their vehicle that's running, or they've got one from the wrecking yard. This is a 4.8 liter LR4. It had the stock camshaft in it right now. In fact, it was all stock with the following exceptions. So we've got a 4.8 liter. It had the stock block, stock crank, stock rods. Pistons, it had JE forged pistons in it because we'd hurt them a long ago, and this one had a small dome in them, so the compression was about a half a point higher than stock. We had our stock 706 heads, stock valves and everything, no porting, but they did have a valve spring upgrade because later on we would be obviously trying different camshafts, so we wanted to go ahead and put the springs in so they would be ready when we did our cam swaps. Stock rockers and push rods and all that. Stock intake manifold, throttle body, we did have long tube headers on it. We had 80-pound Excel injectors in it, again, because later on we would be running boost. But we had the long tube headers and a Holley HP management system so that we could dial in each one of the combinations and optimize the power output. So starting out with our stock LR4 camshaft, our LR4 4.8 liter produced 344 horsepower and 345 foot-pounds of torque. The 344 horsepower came at 5,600 RPM, and the 345 foot-pounds of torque came at 4,800 RPM. So now let's take a look and see what happens if you were to take this to the track. You might try the following things. You might try power braking it, might try flashing the converter, whatever this thing is in, whether it's in a truck or a car or whatever. And you might try different shift points. So we revved this thing out to 6,500 RPM, even though that's on the downside of the curve. We made peak power at 5,600. We revved it to 6,500. If you're going to the track and you're trying to maximize, you know, get the lowest ET and the highest mile an hour, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be running in the RPM range that gives you the highest average power. So in this case, you're going to definitely shift past the power peak and then have it drop back and then come up the power peak and on the downside of the power peak, because that's going to give you the highest average power. Basically, if you just cut off the top side of the curve for whatever the RPM range is for your particular gearing, that's going to be kind of what you want to do. And then obviously you're going to want to get a good 60-foot time and all that stuff. But in terms of power production, that's what we're looking at. But now what happens when we change our camshaft? The first one we're going to look at is something fairly mild. This is a torque cam from Brian Tooley Racing, and I'll go ahead and put the specs up here. Fairly mild, 202 duration kind of thing. So I'll go ahead and put the specs up here and you can take a look at that. But in terms of things that you might want to adjust, this is probably not the wrong cam. This is actually a fairly good cam as a minor upgrade for certainly for a truck or even kind of a performance deal. The torque cam improved the power output by a little over 30 horsepower. We went from 344 to 375. Peak torque went from 345 up to 360 foot-pounds. And the nice thing is the torque cam basically just gained power almost everywhere from 3,000 all the way up, even down at 2,500 where we would start being concerned about the torque converter. The torque cam is going to make as much torque, at least as much torque as the stock cam does, and maybe a touch more. So we're not going to lose anything there. So you could certainly still use the stock converter for that. More converter will almost always help. As long as you have the traction, it'll just put you up in a higher RPM range where the thing is making more power. A lot of times that will improve 60-foot time. And for this one, we're making peak power out at 5,900 RPM. So we've shifted that by 300 RPM. So if you're using this cam, you might also want to shift your shift points, and again, we rev this one out to 6,600 RPM, you might want to adjust your shift points a little bit higher so that you can, again, get the best average amount of power for each one of your shift points. And once you played with that, you're probably going to show that an extra 30 horsepower and good average power production is going to improve your ET. But now let's take a look at another cam where we actually have to sacrifice power bottom to top. Okay, our choices with the Bradley Racing Torque Cam were very easy. We just kind of keep everything the same, make more power everywhere, and away we go. But let's take a look now at a camshaft where some trade-offs are necessary. And it looks like from the change in power, we're probably going to have to throw the kitchen sink at this one. So this is our combination with our stock cam, the 4.8 liter. Here is an LS9 camshaft, a factory LS9 camshaft. And you'll see right off the bat, all the fans of the LS9, yeah, we're making lots of power. It's the most powerful factory camshaft. And it probably is that, along with the LS7. When I tested them, especially on a 5.3, they both essentially made the same power. So, but they're both powerful cams, but they're also both very, very soft down low. So let's look at the good side of this thing. So this thing, the LS9 camshaft increased power from 344 horsepower up to 403 horsepower. So big gains. And as you can see, we're revving this thing out beyond 6,500 RPM. We revved it all the way out to 7,000, where this thing was still making 400, right at 400 horsepower. So it's still doing well. But it's only doing better than the stock cam, the stock LM7 cam, above 4,900 RPM. And that's going to be a problem for two different areas. One, obviously the launch. So we're going to have to be in the lower part of the curve when we launch this thing in first gear. The other thing that could happen, depending on your gearing, and I'm going to have a video coming up about how to choose your shift points in gearing and that kind of stuff. I'll do a whole video on that with all the math involved and how you pick your shift points and stuff coming up. But if we look at this and we shift this thing at 6,500, in some of the gears, it's obviously going to drop down into the range where we've lost a bunch of torque. And even if we shift at 7,000, we're still going to have drops that drop it down into the area where we're losing torque. That's why we're going to raise the shift point beyond 7,000 RPM. But down in first gear, we still have to deal with getting this thing going up into the high RPM where we can take advantage of the extra power offered by this LS9 camshaft. And the way that we're going to do that is two things. So we've already changed shift points. Now we're going to throw the rest of the kitchen sink at it, and that's going to include converter and gearing. So because we're wanting to run lots of RPM, gearing is definitely going to be our friend with a small motor and lots of RPM. So depending on what gearing you have, you're going to step up from a 3 series gear to a 4 series gear, even a mid 4 series gear, and to get this thing moving and run in the RPM range that we want. Obviously, you're going to have to take into account what your gearing is, what your end mile an hour is, what your tire size is. All of the math is associated with it. Like I said, I got a video coming up on that. But the other thing that's going to be really critical for getting this wrong cam actually working is a converter. And in this case, going from a stock converter, which is 1,800 to 2,000 RPM, to a typical kind of 2,500 RPM performance converter, I don't think is going to get the job done. For this LS9 camshaft in a 4.8, I would go up to, and again, now your choice of converter is going to come down to, is this a drag race car that I'm not driving a lot? Is it a street car that I'm occasionally drag racing? That's going to dictate your converter. If this were a car that I was taking to the track and I wanted this thing to run, maybe I'm running boost on it, maybe I'm running nitrous on it, I would go way past the 3,000 RPM range, out near 3,500 stall converter for this thing, because it's making less torque even at 3,500 than the stock cam did. So the stall speed may not be actually what you think it is or what the advertised number is, because we're making such little torque. So I wouldn't be afraid of a 3,500 or even slightly more stall speed converter for this little 4.8, so we could get the thing up in the RPM range and get it towards taking advantage of the added power that the cam has to offer. Now let's take a look at a camshaft where maybe it's between these two. It's not as big of a trade-off, but still makes a lot more power. Okay, guys, we've taken a look at our stock camshaft versus the mild torque cam from Brian Tooley, and then versus the LS9 camshaft, the factory high-performance camshaft, which made a lot more power on the top, but made it softer down low. Now let's take a look at an aftermarket camshaft. This one came from the guys at Summit Racing. It was one of their Pro LS cams. It was a part number 8720, and I'll go ahead and put the specs up here. You can see it's not a really big cam. It's fairly mild. It's like a stage 1 or 1.5, 2, somewhere on that range if you like dealing with cams and naming them the stages. But it is a good cam, and it was the camshaft that I ran back when we did our sloppy stage 2 versus the world to see how these other comparable cams fared, and they all did pretty well back in that test. But let's see how the Summit cam fares versus our stock LM7 cam or LR4 camshaft. Here is the Summit camshaft, and as you can see right off the bat, it did make a lot more power. It went from 344 horsepower to 416 horsepower. And this camshaft, like the LS9 camshaft that we ran, also we ran this thing out to 7,000 RPM. In this case, this thing was still making 410 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. And what that would mean in an actual application in a vehicle, if you were trying to optimize, mile an hour and ET at the drag strip with your transmission, you're going to want to shift this thing past 7,000 RPM. That's right, even with a mild camshaft like the Summit cam, in a 4.8, because the motors are smaller, they're going to want to rev. And this is a perfect example of that and why you have to make sure that you choose your springs properly, because you're going to want to shift this thing past 7,000 RPM when you're going down the quarter mile. That's one thing. And obviously, because we're running it out past 7,000 RPM, gearing probably would help this thing, just like it did with the LS9. But here's the other thing I want you to look at. And this is why I think this kind of aftermarket cam is a better choice than an LS9. Maybe not from a financial standpoint, because this is certainly going to cost more. But here's what would make the thing a lot more fun on the street and ultimately at the track. This camshaft would be faster than an LS9 in the same vehicle at the track. But if we look down here at 3,300 RPM, which is where the crossover point is, which is where this Summit cam started making more power than the stock camshaft, that tells us that unlike the LS9 camshaft, we can get away with a lower stall speed converter on this combination. Now, we probably couldn't run we're not going to use a stock stall speed, but we could use something that's like 3,000 or 31 or 3,200 RPM, maybe near the crossover point, and we don't have to resort to a 3,500 or 4,000 RPM stall converter. Now, that being said, you still might, if this was ultimately a drag race car and you want to put more stall converter in and you're going to run this thing to 7,500, hey, a 3,500 stall speed converter is probably going to make the thing accelerate harder. But the nice thing is if we can go down in stall speed on our converter, it's going to make the thing a little bit maybe more drivable for your, a combination to be more likely to be a street strip with more focusing on the street than the strip. And so this is kind of a good combination. This is something that you'll see from lots of camshafts, from Brian Tooley or for the guys at Summit at Texas Speed, any kind of camshaft like this, because we tested a bunch of them on this 4.8, they're going to provide the same kind of thing. I know that the LS9 camshaft, because it makes pretty good peak power, is desirable for a lot of people, but it's just hard to get past all that loss in low speed torque. All right, shareholder, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I've tested a lot of cams that are the wrong cam, but sometimes we get it right. Thanks for watching.